The park ranger's radio crackled mid-transmission, his weathered hand freezing on the receiver as an impossible sound echoed across Crystal Lake. The bone-crushing squeeze of something massive wrapped around desperate, choking gasps. It wasn't a typical predator attack. 20 feet of Burmese python coiled around a female grizzly bear like a nightmare from another continent. Sarah Mitchell's coffee thermos hit the rocky shore with a metallic clang, her veterinary training warring with disbelief as she watched North America's apex predator being slowly suffocated by an invasive species that had no business existing in Wyoming's wilderness. Tank Rodriguez fumbled for his tranquilizer gun, hands trembling as childhood memories of circus elephants collided with the brutal reality before them. An elderly photographer dropped to his knees, recognizing something in the massive male bear now charging toward the scene, a scar pattern he'd seen 20 years ago on a rescued cub. "Get the emergency medical kit, now!" Sarah screamed, her voice cutting through the morning stillness. What force had brought this tropical killer to Yellowstone? And could they save the grizzly before the python's deadly embrace claimed another victim? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning mist still clung to Crystal Lake's surface when Dr. Sarah Mitchell first spotted the unusual ripples near the shore. At 35, she carried herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to compartmentalize grief into productive action. 3 years had passed since her divorce, since David walked out during her miscarriage recovery, muttering something about too much drama and needing space. Now she found solace in the methodical work of wildlife research, measuring water temperatures and tracking migration patterns with the kind of devotion she once reserved for human relationships. Tank Rodriguez had been patrolling these same trails for 15 years, but the last 3 had felt different. The 45-year-old ranger carried a weight that went beyond his official duties, a guilt that gnawed at him during quiet moments like these. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his patrol vehicle a little too tightly, knuckles white with the memory of a trigger pulled in darkness, of 2 bears that never made it home. He'd traded his hunting rifle for a ranger's badge, but redemption felt as elusive as the wildlife he now protected. George "Papa" Thompson adjusted his camera lens with the careful attention of a man who had learned that moments of beauty were fleeting and precious. At 78, his daily visits to the park served as both therapy and pilgrimage. The framed photograph of his late wife Mary remained tucked in his shirt pocket, while the military folded flag honoring his son Jacob sat on his mantelpiece back home. Photography had become his language for grief, each captured image a prayer for the family he'd lost to war and cancer. 50 miles away, Vincent Carruthers reviewed his detailed charts with the obsession of a man trying to solve an unsolvable equation. The 52-year-old former psychology professor had spent the last 2 years studying what he called devotion under extreme stress. His modest cabin was filled with research notes, tracking data, and photographs of animal pairs across multiple national parks. The framed photo of his son Connor remained the only personal item on his desk. A young man, frozen in time, forever 22, forever reaching toward a girlfriend he died saving from an oncoming truck. Bruno moved through the forest with the careful grace of an 800-pound predator who had learned that survival meant vigilance. The massive grizzly's distinctive shoulder scar told a story he couldn't share with the humans who occasionally crossed his path. 3 years of solitude had taught him that loss was the price of love, but the arrival of Stella had awakened something he thought buried forever. The 6-year-old female had brought light back into his world, her gentle nature balancing his protective instincts. As dawn broke fully over Yellowstone's wilderness, these 5 lives moved toward an intersection none of them could have anticipated. The park's ancient rhythms continued unchanged, unaware that within hours everything would shift. The morning held the crisp promise of autumn, the kind of perfect day that made tourists reach for their cameras and locals pause to appreciate their surroundings. None of them knew that 20 feet of apex predator was already moving through the lake's depths, carrying with it the power to change everything they thought they understood about love, loyalty, and the price of devotion. The attack came without warning, erupting from the lake's deceptively calm surface, like something torn from humanity's most primal nightmares. Bruno and Stella had approached the water's edge as they did every morning, their massive forms moving with the unhurried confidence of apex predators in their own domain. The early autumn air carried the scent of pine and the promise of winter, while golden leaves drifted lazily across the mirror-like surface of Crystal Lake. Stella lowered her head to drink, her reflection rippling in the clear water as Bruno stood sentinel beside her, his scarred shoulders testament to years of survival in the wilderness. For a moment, the scene embodied the perfect harmony of wild Yellowstone. Two magnificent creatures existing in their natural state, unburdened by human interference or artificial threats. Then the water exploded. 20 feet of Burmese python erupted from the depths with the force of a freight train, its massive coils unfurling like some ancient sea monster from the deepest trenches of human fear. The snake's body, thick as a telephone pole and glistening with lake water, moved with terrifying precision as it launched itself at Stella's exposed neck. The female grizzly barely had time to lift her head before the python's crushing embrace enveloped her, coils wrapping around her torso with the methodical efficiency of a living noose. Stella's roar of shock and terror echoed across the lake, a sound that seemed to fracture the morning's tranquility into 1,000 sharp pieces. Her powerful legs buckled as the python's grip tightened, constricting with a force that could crush steel. The snake's head, larger than a man's torso, locked onto her shoulder as its body continued to coil, each loop adding exponentially to the crushing pressure around her ribs and lungs. Bruno's response was immediate and primal. The massive male grizzly's bellow of rage shattered the air, a sound so raw and powerful that birds exploded from trees half a mile away. But instead of charging blindly into the fray, Bruno circled the struggling pair with tactical precision, his dark eyes assessing the situation with an intelligence that would have surprised the humans beginning to gather. Papa Thompson had been adjusting his telephoto lens when the attack began, his photographer's instincts capturing the first moments of the struggle before his grandfather's heart took over. The elderly man dropped his expensive camera without a thought, his weathered hands reaching instinctively for the bear spray on his belt as he stumbled toward the shore. "Sweet Mary in heaven," he whispered, invoking his late wife's name as he had during every crisis since her passing. Tank Rodriguez was 200 yards away when Stella's first roar reached him, his ranger training kicking in before his conscious mind fully processed what he was witnessing. His hand moved to his radio even as his legs carried him toward the sound, muscle memory from 15 years of emergency response overriding the shock that threatened to paralyze him. "Base, this is Rodriguez." He spoke into the device, his voice tight with controlled tension. "Code red at Crystal Lake. Large predator situation. Need immediate backup and veterinary support." Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been collecting water samples when the python struck, her scientific mind initially rejecting what her eyes were showing her. Burmese pythons didn't exist in Wyoming's ecosystem. The cold winters alone should have made survival impossible. Yet here was undeniable proof coiling around one of North America's most powerful predators, defying every law of biogeography she'd studied. Her veterinary bag hit the ground as she ran toward the struggle, her divorced woman's pragmatism warring with professional protocols that had never anticipated a scenario this impossible. The python's grip tightened with each passing second, its muscular coils operating like a biological hydraulic press. Stella's breathing became labored, her powerful limbs thrashing against the constricting embrace as Bruno continued his calculated assault on the snake's head and neck. The male grizzly's claws raked across the python's scales, drawing blood but failing to break the creature's death grip on his mate. "Jesus Christ," Tank breathed as he reached the scene, his hand hovering over his tranquilizer gun while his mind raced through impossible options. Standard protocol called for non-intervention in natural predator-prey relationships, but nothing about this situation was natural. The python was an invasive species, an apex predator from another continent that had no business strangling native wildlife in America's premier national park. Bruno's strategy became clear as he systematically attacked the python's most vulnerable points: its eyes, nostrils, and the sensitive area behind its skull. The bear's intelligence was evident in his tactical approach, avoiding the snake's powerful body while targeting areas that might force it to release its grip. Blood streamed from wounds on both animals as the battle intensified, primitive fury meeting reptilian determination in a struggle that seemed to embody the eternal conflict between mammalian emotion and cold-blooded calculation. Sarah reached them as Stella's eyes began to roll back, the female grizzly's struggles growing weaker as oxygen deprivation took its toll. "The pressure's collapsing her airways," she shouted to Tank, her medical training overriding her shock. "If we don't do something in the next few minutes, she's going to suffocate." Papa Thompson arrived breathless, his 78-year-old legs carrying him faster than they had in years. The sight of Bruno's desperate fight triggered memories he'd tried to bury. Another bear, another time, another impossible situation that had ended with a young cub in his care. "That's my boy," he whispered, recognition dawning as he studied the distinctive scar pattern across Bruno's shoulder. "That's my Bruno." The python sensed the approaching humans and responded by tightening its coils even further, Stella's ribs creaking audibly under the pressure. Bruno's roars took on a different quality, not just rage now, but something approaching desperation as he watched his mate's strength failing. The male grizzly's dark eyes met Sarah's across the 15 feet of blood-stained shore, and in that moment, something passed between them that transcended species barriers. Tank made the decision that would haunt him for weeks to come. "I'm taking the shot," he announced, raising his tranquilizer rifle toward the python's head. "Low dose, just enough to make it loosen up." "Wait!" Sarah called out, her hand on his arm. "If you hit it wrong, the reflex could crush her completely. We need a different approach." Bruno seemed to understand the human's hesitation. The massive bear stepped back from his assault on the python and, in a gesture that would be replayed on news stations worldwide, nudged Sarah's medical bag toward the struggling pair with his snout. His message was unmistakable. He was asking for help, seeking an alliance with the very species that had historically been his greatest threat. The morning sun climbed higher as the standoff continued, 3 humans and 1 grizzly facing an impossible choice. Every second meant more pressure on Stella's failing respiratory system, but every intervention risked triggering the python's final, crushing response. The lake's surface had returned to its mirror-like calm, offering no hint of the life-and-death struggle playing out on its shores. The moment that would redefine everything, humanity thought it knew about wild animals, began with Bruno's gentle nudge of Sarah's medical bag. The massive grizzly, bloodied from his battle with the python, stepped back and waited, not with the patience of a predator calculating its next strike, but with the expectant trust of a creature seeking partnership. His dark eyes held an intelligence that made Sarah's veterinary textbooks seem woefully inadequate. "He's asking us to help," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Stella's increasingly labored breathing. The female grizzly's struggles had weakened to pitiful twitches, her massive frame going limp as the python's coils continued their relentless compression. Dear God, he actually understands what we can do. Tank lowered his tranquilizer rifle, his weathered hands trembling slightly as the implications of Bruno's behavior sank in. 15 years of ranger experience had taught him to expect the unexpected from wildlife, but this transcended every protocol in the manual. "This ain't natural," he muttered, then caught himself. "I mean, this kind of thinking, this kind of trust." Papa Thompson stepped forward slowly, his photographer's eye capturing details that his grandfather's heart was just beginning to process. The scar across Bruno's left shoulder wasn't just distinctive, it was familiar. 20 years of memory came flooding back as he studied the bear's massive frame, remembering a tiny cub he'd bottle-fed through harsh Montana winters. "Bruno," he whispered, hardly daring to believe. "My God, is that really you, boy?" The bear's head turned at the sound of his name, and for a moment, the life and death struggle on the shore faded into background. Recognition flickered in Bruno's eyes as he studied the elderly man's face, processing changes that 2 decades had wrought. A soft whoof escaped the grizzly's throat, not a threat or warning, but something approaching a greeting between old friends separated by impossible circumstances. Sarah forced herself to focus on the medical crisis at hand. "Tank, I need you to keep that rifle ready, but don't shoot unless I give the signal. Papa Thompson, right? I need you to back up about 10 feet and talk to Bruno. Keep him calm while I work." Her veterinary training kicked into overdrive as she approached the python with careful, measured steps. The snake's head swiveled toward her, its cold reptilian eyes tracking her movement with predatory calculation. 20 feet of muscle and scale, this creature represented evolutionary perfection in the art of killing. A biological machine designed for constriction and consumption, but it was also an invader in an ecosystem where it didn't belong, its presence as unnatural as a shark in a mountain stream. "Easy, girl," Sarah murmured to Stella, whose breathing had become so shallow it was barely detectable. The female grizzly's eyes were glazed with oxygen deprivation, but they still tracked to Bruno's face with unmistakable affection. Even on the edge of death, her focus remained on her mate, rather than her own suffering. Papa Thompson's voice carried across the tense silence, gentle and weathered like aged whiskey. "That's my boy, Bruno. Remember me, son? Remember those cold nights in the cabin when you were just a little thing, no bigger than a house cat? Mary used to say you'd grow up to be something special, and look at you now, protecting your lady like a true gentleman." The effect on Bruno was immediate and profound. The massive bear's aggressive posture softened, though his attention remained fixed on Stella's predicament. His response to Papa Thompson's voice seemed to unlock something deeper than mere recognition, a connection that transcended the usual barriers between human and wild animal. Sarah had reached the python's midsection, where the crushing pressure was most intense around Stella's ribcage. Her gloved hands moved with surgical precision as she assessed the situation, looking for any weakness in the snake's grip that might offer a solution. "The good news is that pythons kill by suffocation, not by crushing bones," she announced, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "If we can get it to loosen up for just 30 seconds, Stella might survive this." Tank's radio crackled with incoming calls from park headquarters, but he ignored them. The situation had moved beyond standard protocols into uncharted territory where bureaucratic procedures seemed not just inadequate, but insulting. "Doc, what do you need from us?" he asked, his thumb hovering over the tranquilizer rifle's safety. "I need Bruno to trust me completely," Sarah replied, reaching into her medical bag for a syringe filled with a mild muscle relaxant. "This has to be precise. Too much, and the python goes into death throes and crushes her. Too little, and nothing happens. But I need to inject it directly into the snake's nervous system. and that means getting close to those coils. Bruno seemed to understand the gravity of what Sarah was proposing. The bear approached the python from the opposite side, positioning himself where he could grab the snake's head if it attempted to strike at the veterinarian. His cooperation was so deliberate, so clearly intentional, that all three humans felt the hair on their arms rise in recognition of something unprecedented. "In all my born days," Papa Thompson murmured, "never thought I'd see the day when a wild bear would partner up with humans like this." "It's like he knows exactly what you're trying to do, Sarah." The python sensed the increased activity and responded by shifting its coils, seeking a better grip on its prey. Stella's breathing stopped entirely for 5 terrifying seconds before resuming in short, desperate gasps. Time was running out, and everyone present could feel the window of opportunity closing with each passing moment. Sarah positioned herself at the optimal injection site, a spot where the python's spine was closest to the surface. "Bruno, I need you to keep that head occupied," she said, speaking to the bear as she would to any surgical assistant. "On 3, 1, 2. Instead of waiting for 3, Bruno moved with perfect timing, his massive paws clamping down on the python's skull just as Sarah drove the needle home. The coordination was flawless, as if they'd rehearsed this impossible procedure 100 times. The muscle relaxant entered the snake's system directly, beginning its work within seconds. The python's response was immediate but controlled, exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Instead of the violent thrashing that would have crushed Stella instantly, the snake's grip loosened gradually as the medication took effect. Its coils, which had been tight as steel bands, began to slacken incrementally. "It's working," Tank breathed, hardly daring to believe what he was witnessing. "The damn thing's actually letting go." Stella's first full breath in nearly 10 minutes was audible across the lake shore, a desperate gasp that seemed to pull life back into her massive frame. Her eyes focused with renewed clarity as oxygen flooded her system, and the first thing she saw was Bruno's face hovering protectively above her. But the crisis wasn't over. The python, though weakened by the muscle relaxant, was still a formidable predator with enough strength to inflict serious damage. As its grip on Stella loosened completely, the snake's head turned toward Sarah with unmistakable predatory intent. Bruno's reaction was instantaneous. The grizzly placed himself between the veterinarian and the snake, accepting a strike to his own shoulder that would have seriously injured a human. His roar of pain echoed across the lake, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he maintained his protective stance until Tank's tranquilizer dart found its mark in the python's neck. As the massive snake finally succumbed to the combination of muscle relaxant and tranquilizer, collapsing in loose coils around the lake shore, Stella struggled to her feet. Her legs shook with the effort, but she was alive, breathing freely for the first time in what felt like hours. The immediate crisis was over, but the implications of what had just occurred were only beginning to sink in. 3 humans had just witnessed interspecies cooperation on a level that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and emotional capacity. Bruno had not just asked for help, he had actively participated in a complex rescue operation demonstrating planning, trust, and tactical thinking that belonged in research journals rather than field reports. Papa Thompson's weathered face was streaked with tears as he watched Bruno gently nuzzle Stella's neck, checking for injuries with the tender care of a concerned mate. "That's love," he whispered. "That's pure, honest-to-God love. And it don't matter what species you are." The journey to Yellowstone Wildlife Medical Center became a pilgrimage witnessed by the world. Within hours of Papa Thompson's first photographs hitting social media, the hashtag #SaveBruno and Stella had exploded across every platform, transforming a remote wildlife emergency into a global phenomenon that transcended species barriers and touched something fundamental in the human heart. Bruno refused to leave Stella's side during the transport, a decision that forced Sarah and her team to abandon standard protocols entirely. The modified flatbed truck carried both bears through winding mountain roads, while news helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their cameras capturing every moment of the unprecedented journey. Bruno positioned himself as a living shield around Stella's prone form, his massive body absorbing every bump and jolt that threatened to disturb her fragile recovery. Doctor. Sarah Mitchell had performed thousands of emergency procedures in her career, but nothing had prepared her for conducting veterinary triage under the scrutiny of 50 million viewers. Her hands remained steady as she monitored Stella's vital signs during the hour-long transport, but her mind reeled with the implications of what they'd witnessed at Crystal Lake. The cooperation between Bruno and the human rescue team defied every textbook she'd studied, challenging fundamental assumptions about wild animal intelligence and emotional capacity. "She's stable, but barely," Sarah announced to Tank and Papa Thompson as they reached the medical facility. "Internal bleeding, possible rib fractures, and severe tissue damage from the constriction. We're looking at major surgery, and that's assuming she's strong enough to survive anesthesia." The Wildlife Medical Center had never accommodated a patient with a devoted mate refusing to leave the premises. Bruno's presence created logistical nightmares that the staff scrambled to address, but his behavior continued to astonish everyone who witnessed it. As they transferred Stella to the surgical suite, Bruno positioned himself outside the operating room doors with the patience of a worried spouse in a human hospital waiting room. Tank Rodriguez found himself fielding calls from park headquarters, federal wildlife agencies, and media outlets from around the world. The python attack had raised uncomfortable questions about invasive species management and ecosystem security, but it was Bruno's display of emotional intelligence that had captured global attention. "Sir, I understand your concerns about protocol," Tank spoke into his satellite phone, "but we're dealing with something unprecedented here. This isn't just about two bears. This is about redefining what we think we know about animal consciousness." Papa Thompson positioned himself near Bruno, his weathered photographer's hands capturing intimate moments between the massive grizzly and the antiseptic world of modern veterinary medicine. The bear's behavior continued to trigger memories from 2 decades past, bottle feedings in the middle of winter nights, teaching a curious cub to fish in mountain streams, the day he'd finally released Bruno back into the wild with a mixture of pride and heartbreak that only a parent could understand. "You remember, don't you, boy?" Papa Thompson whispered to Bruno as they waited outside the surgical suite. "Remember how Mary used to sing to you when you had nightmares? Amazing grace, always amazing grace. She said it calmed you down better than anything." The elderly man's voice carried the weight of accumulated loss: a son killed in Iraq, a wife taken by cancer, and now the possibility of losing the bear that had filled some small portion of the void they'd left behind. The surgical procedure revealed complications that Sarah had feared but hoped to avoid. Stella's internal injuries were more extensive than initial examinations had suggested, requiring delicate work to repair damaged organs and stop internal bleeding. The female grizzly's pregnancy, still unknown to everyone present, complicated every decision as Sarah navigated between saving the mother and protecting the developing cubs she hadn't yet discovered. Bruno's vigil outside the operating room became the focal point of an international media circus that transformed the remote medical facility into the center of a global conversation about human-animal relationships. Protesters gathered on both sides of the complex, animal rights activists demanding non-interference with natural processes, while conservation advocates argued for aggressive intervention to save an apex predator from an invasive species attack. Tank's investigation into the python's origins had yielded disturbing preliminary results. The snake's size and condition suggested it hadn't been surviving in Wyoming's harsh climate for extended periods, indicating recent introduction to the ecosystem. Serial numbers on surgical implants found in the python's body led to exotic animal dealers and private collectors, opening the possibility that Stella's attack hadn't been a random encounter with an escaped pet. "This wasn't an accident," Tank reported to Sarah during a brief break in her surgical work. "Someone put that python in Crystal Lake deliberately." The question is whether they were targeting these specific bears or just conducting some kind of sick experiment with invasive predators. Vincent Carruthers watched the developing media coverage from his remote cabin 50 miles north of the medical facility, his psychological research taking on dimensions he hadn't anticipated. The global response to Bruno's devotion validated theories he'd been developing about emotional intelligence in higher mammals, but it also forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own experimental methods. The data he'd collected through strategic predator releases across multiple national parks suddenly seemed less like objective research and more like elaborate torture designed to satisfy his own psychological needs. Sarah's surgical work extended through the night as she addressed each of Stella's injuries with methodical precision. The female grizzly's resilience impressed even seasoned veterinary staff, her vital signs remaining stable despite the trauma she'd endured. But it was the ultrasound revelation in the early morning hours that changed everything. Stella was carrying twin cubs, their tiny forms visible on the monitor like promises of future hope wrapped in present danger. "She's pregnant," Sarah announced to the assembled team, her voice barely above a whisper. "Twins, maybe 8 weeks along. Everything we do from here forward isn't just about saving Stella. We're trying to save 3 lives." The news of Stella's pregnancy spread through social media like wildfire, transforming an already emotional story into something approaching religious significance for millions of followers worldwide. Comments poured in from every continent, messages of support in dozens of languages, prayer circles forming in communities that had never heard of Yellowstone before Bruno and Stella became household names. Bruno seemed to sense the change in the medical team's urgency even before anyone told him about the pregnancy. His behavior shifted from worried mate to expectant father, his protective instincts intensifying as he positioned himself closer to the surgical suite doors. Papa Thompson noticed the change immediately, recognizing patterns from his own experience raising Bruno as a cub. "He knows," Papa Thompson told Sarah during her brief appearance in the waiting area. "Don't ask me how, but he knows about those babies. Bears have senses we don't understand, connections we can't measure with our instruments." Tank's investigation had led him to Vincent Carruthers through a complex trail of financial transactions and exotic animal permits. The former psychology professor's research into animal emotional intelligence had taken increasingly extreme forms over the past 2 years, culminating in controlled predator-prey scenarios designed to test the limits of interspecies devotion. The global fundraising campaign for Stella's medical care exceeded all expectations, reaching $3 million within 48 hours as people around the world contributed to what had become a symbol of love transcending species boundaries. Corporate sponsors lined up to associate themselves with the story, while documentary filmmakers negotiated for exclusive access to Bruno and Stella's recovery process. Tank's confrontation with Vincent Carruthers came as Stella emerged from her second surgical procedure, still critical but stable enough to give hope for recovery. The former professor's confession revealed the scope of his experimental program: 12 invasive predator releases across 6 national parks, all designed to test emotional bonds between mated pairs of native wildlife. Vincent's motivation emerged through hours of interrogation, a twisted attempt to find meaning in his son Connor's death by proving that true love required ultimate sacrifice. "My boy died saving his girlfriend from a drunk driver," Vincent explained to Tank in the sterile interrogation room at park headquarters. "Threw himself in front of an oncoming truck without hesitation. I needed to know if that kind of love existed in nature, if Connor's sacrifice represented something universal rather than just human foolishness." The revelation that Stella's attack had been deliberately orchestrated sent shockwaves through the conservation community and beyond. Bruno's heroic behavior, which had already captured global attention, took on new significance as evidence of animal emotional intelligence sophisticated enough to inspire criminal research. Vincent's arrest led to the discovery of detailed documentation spanning 2 years of similar experiments, each designed to push mated wildlife pairs to their emotional and physical limits. Sarah's work with Stella continued around the clock as the female grizzly fought through complications that threatened both her life and her pregnancy. The medical team had expanded to include specialists from veterinary schools across the country, all drawn by the unprecedented opportunity to study grizzly bear maternal physiology under controlled conditions. But it was Bruno's continued presence that provided the most significant factor in Stella's recovery. His devotional vigil creating a psychological environment that supported healing in ways that medical science was only beginning to understand. Papa Thompson's role as intermediary between Bruno and the medical staff had evolved into something approaching translator as the bear's complex behaviors revealed increasingly sophisticated communication patterns. Bruno would approach different areas of the medical facility based on Stella's condition, somehow sensing when her vital signs were declining and positioning himself accordingly. His responses to medical procedures suggested understanding of cause and effect relationships that challenged traditional assumptions about animal cognition. The media attention surrounding Bruno and Stella's story had transformed from wildlife news into a global phenomenon that touched on themes of love, loyalty, and the fundamental connections between all living creatures. Religious leaders offered interpretations of the bear's bond as evidence of divine love manifest in nature, while scientists struggled to explain behaviors that seemed to transcend traditional models of animal intelligence. Tank Rodriguez found himself at the center of an investigation that extended far beyond Vincent Carruthers' individual crimes into a broader examination of wildlife research ethics and invasive species management. The python that had nearly killed Stella represented just one piece of a larger puzzle involving exotic animal trafficking, unregulated research programs, and the exploitation of wildlife for entertainment and profit. As Stella entered her 3rd day of recovery, showing signs of improvement that gave hope for both her survival and the health of her unborn cubs, Bruno's vigil had become a symbol recognized around the world. His unwavering devotion, captured in thousands of photographs and hours of video footage, represented something that transcended species barriers and spoke to the universal nature of love and commitment. The story had evolved beyond a simple wildlife rescue into a meditation on the nature of consciousness, the reality of animal emotions, and the possibility of communication and cooperation between species that mainstream science had only recently begun to acknowledge. Bruno and Stella's ordeal was becoming a watershed moment in human understanding of animal intelligence, challenging assumptions and opening new avenues for research into the complex emotional lives of creatures previously dismissed as operating purely on instinct. The crisis reached its crescendo on the 4th night when Stella's condition deteriorated rapidly, her body rejecting the stress of recovery while trying to sustain 2 developing cubs. Sarah's medical team worked frantically as monitors screamed warnings throughout the facility, the female grizzly's vital signs plummeting toward levels that indicated imminent system failure. Bruno's response was immediate and heartbreaking. The massive bear pressed himself against the surgical suite's reinforced glass, his deep vocalizations carrying a grief so profound that seasoned veterinarians found themselves wiping away tears. "We're losing her," Sarah announced to the assembled team, her voice cracking under the weight of exhaustion and emotional investment. "The internal bleeding has resumed and her body can't handle the stress of major surgery in her current condition. We have maybe 6 hours to find a solution or we're going to lose both mother and cubs." Papa Thompson approached Bruno with the careful movements of a man who understood that grief could transform even the gentlest creature into something unpredictable. The elderly photographer's weathered hands carried a small digital player loaded with recordings of his late wife Mary singing hymns, the same songs that had calmed a frightened bear cub 20 years earlier. "Remember this, boy?" he whispered, pressing play as amazing grace filled the tense atmosphere of the medical facility. Bruno's reaction was immediate and profound. The massive bear's agitated pacing ceased as he settled beside the glass partition, his dark eyes fixed on Stella's prone form while his breathing synchronized with the familiar melody. The effect on the medical equipment was measurable. Stella's heart rate stabilized, her blood pressure improved, and for the first time in hours, her vital signs showed signs of improvement rather than decline. Tank Rodriguez burst through the facility's main doors carrying evidence that would transform the entire investigation. His confrontation with Vincent Carruthers had yielded not just a confession, but detailed research files documenting 2 years of systematic predator releases designed to test animal emotional bonds under extreme stress. "The sick bastard has been conducting psychological experiments on wildlife across 6 states, Tank announced, his anger barely contained. Bruno and Stella weren't random victims. They were specifically targeted because Carruthers had been monitoring their relationship for months. The revelation sent shockwaves through the medical team and the global audience following the story. Vincent's research notes revealed disturbing details about his selection criteria for test subjects, choosing mated pairs that displayed above-average emotional attachment and then subjecting them to carefully orchestrated life-threatening scenarios. The Python attack had been the culmination of his work designed to push Bruno's devotion to its absolute limits while generating data about animal emotional resilience under extreme conditions. Sarah found herself making decisions that transcended veterinary medicine as she struggled to save Stella and her unborn cubs. The female grizzly's pregnancy had progressed to a point where the cubs might survive premature delivery, but attempting to save them would almost certainly cost Stella her life. The alternative, focusing all efforts on the mother, offered better odds for Stella's survival, but would likely result in the loss of both cubs. It was a choice that no textbook had prepared her for, complicated by the knowledge that Bruno somehow understood the stakes involved. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the country's leading expert in bear reproduction, arrived at the facility as Stella entered her most critical phase. The specialist's examination revealed that the cubs were more developed than initial estimates had suggested, possibly viable if delivered within the next 24 hours. "We're looking at a window of maybe 8 to 12 hours, she told Sarah. "After that, the cubs won't survive even if we can deliver them, and Stella's chances of surviving a cesarean section drop to almost 0. Bruno's behavior during this critical period continued to astonish everyone present. The massive bear seemed to understand the medical team's urgency, positioning himself where he could maintain visual contact with Stella while staying clear of the medical equipment. His vocalizations had taken on a different quality, not the aggressive roars of a threatened predator, but something approaching the gentle rumbling sounds that bears make when comforting their young. The global response to Stella's deteriorating condition created a media phenomenon that transcended wildlife conservation into something approaching religious vigil. Prayer groups formed in communities worldwide, with people of all faiths offering intercessions for the bear family's survival. Social media platforms struggle to handle the volume of messages, photos, and videos as millions of people shared their own stories of animals who had demonstrated extraordinary devotion and intelligence. Papa Thompson's recognition of Bruno had opened floodgates of memory that now seemed crucial to understanding the bear's exceptional behavior. The elderly man shared stories with Sarah and Tank about Bruno's unusual intelligence as a cub, his ability to understand complex instructions, and his obvious emotional attachments to the humans who had raised him. "Mary always said he was special," Papa Thompson explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just smart for a bear, but smart in ways that made you forget he wasn't human." Tank's investigation had expanded beyond Vincent Carruthers to encompass a broader network of researchers conducting unethical wildlife experiments under the guise of conservation science. The python that had attacked Stella was traced to a facility in Florida that specialized in breeding large constrictors for private collectors and researchers willing to pay premium prices for specific species and sizes. Financial records revealed payments from multiple universities and private research foundations, suggesting that Vincent's work was part of a larger pattern of exploiting wildlife for psychological and behavioral studies. The arrival of Native American tribal elders from the Crow Nation added a spiritual dimension to the vigil that resonated deeply with Papa Thompson's own beliefs about the interconnectedness of all living creatures. Elder Joseph Crow. Feather brought traditional medicines and ceremonies that had been used for centuries to heal both animals and humans, offering treatments that modern veterinary science had never considered, but which seemed to provide measurable benefits to Stella's recovery. "The bear people have always been our teachers about love and protection," Elder Crow Feather explained to the assembled medical team. "This male, he shows us what our ancestors knew, that the heart of a bear is deeper than the deepest canyon, stronger than the strongest storm. His woman will live because his love calls her spirit back from the shadow world." Sarah found herself integrating traditional healing practices with modern veterinary medicine in ways that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The combination of herbal treatments, ceremonial songs, and advanced medical technology created a healing environment that addressed both Stella's physical trauma and the psychological stress that Bruno was experiencing. The results were measurable and undeniable. Stella's vital signs stabilized, her internal bleeding decreased, and for the first time since the attack, her body showed signs of actively healing rather than merely surviving. The climactic moment came at dawn on the 5th day when Stella's labor began naturally, her body finally strong enough to attempt delivery of the cubs that had sustained her through the worst of her injuries. Bruno's response was immediate and profound. The massive bear positioned himself as close to the delivery room as possible, his deep vocalizations providing a constant soundtrack of encouragement and protection. Sarah and her team worked through the most challenging delivery of their careers, bringing 2 healthy cubs into the world while ensuring Stella's survival through the process. The birth of Hope and Connor, names chosen by Papa Thompson in honor of the new life emerging from tragedy, marked a turning point not just in the bear's story, but in global understanding of animal emotional intelligence. The images of Bruno's first meeting with his cubs, his gentle inspection of the tiny creatures while Stella rested, captured something fundamental about the nature of family bonds that transcended species boundaries. Vincent Carruthers' arrest and subsequent confession had exposed a network of unethical research that prompted congressional hearings and new legislation protecting wildlife from exploitation in the name of science. His twisted quest to understand the nature of sacrificial love through animal experimentation had ultimately revealed the very qualities he sought to measure, but in ways that condemned his methods while celebrating the creatures he had tormented. Tank Rodriguez found himself at the center of a transformation in wildlife management philosophy that would influence conservation practices for generations. His investigation had revealed systemic problems in the oversight of wildlife research, leading to new protocols that prioritized animal welfare over data collection and established clear boundaries between legitimate conservation science and exploitative experimentation. The medical facility had been transformed into something resembling a shrine as people from around the world sent flowers, letters, and donations to support the bear family's recovery. Children's drawings depicting Bruno and Stella covered the walls, while messages of hope and inspiration arrived in dozens of languages from every continent. The story had become a global touchstone for discussions about love, family, and the fundamental connections that bind all living creatures together. As Stella began nursing her cubs under Bruno's watchful protection, the world witnessed something that challenged every assumption about wild animal behavior and emotional capacity. The family unit that had emerged from near tragedy represented hope for more than just their own survival. They had become symbols of resilience, devotion, and the possibility of understanding and cooperation between species that had previously seemed impossible. The tragedy that would test everyone's faith in miracles began 3 weeks after the cub's birth, when Hope, the smaller of the twins, developed breathing difficulties that rapidly escalated into a life-threatening respiratory crisis. Sarah's medical team worked frantically through the night as the tiny cub's underdeveloped lungs struggled to sustain life, her small body fighting battles that seemed impossible for something so fragile and new. Bruno's response to his daughter's distress was heartbreaking in its intensity. The massive bear, who had shown such remarkable composure throughout Stella's recovery, began displaying signs of severe psychological stress as Hope's condition deteriorated. His deep vocalizations took on a quality of desperation that seemed to echo through every corner of the medical facility, a sound so primal and grief-stricken that it moved veteran wildlife specialists to tears. "We're doing everything we can," Sarah told Papa Thompson as they watched Bruno pace frantically outside the neonatal intensive care unit. "But Hope was born premature, and her respiratory system just isn't developed enough to handle the stress. Cubs this young, they're incredibly fragile, and we're already pushing the boundaries of what's medically possible." Stella's own condition began to decline as maternal stress compounded her still fragile recovery from the python attack. The female grizzly seemed to understand that her daughter was fighting for life, and her body responded with physiological changes that threatened to undo weeks of healing progress. Her milk production decreased, her appetite vanished, and her vital signs showed patterns consistent with grief-related depression observed in higher mammals. Tank Rodriguez found himself coordinating a media nightmare as news of Hope's crisis reached the global audience that had invested emotionally in the bear family's survival. Social media platforms crashed under the volume of prayer requests, well wishes, and desperate pleas for updates from millions of followers who had found hope and meaning in Bruno and Stella's love story. The hashtag #SaveHope became the top trending topic worldwide, transforming a veterinary emergency into a shared human experience of helplessness and faith. The medical challenges of treating a premature grizzly cub pushed veterinary science into uncharted territory. Hope's tiny lungs required mechanical assistance that had never been attempted on wildlife, while her immune system remained too underdeveloped to handle the stress of invasive procedures. Sarah found herself making minute-by-minute decisions that balanced aggressive intervention against the risk of causing more harm than healing. Papa Thompson's vigil beside Bruno became a testament to the power of shared grief that transcended species boundaries. The elderly man spoke constantly to the distraught bear, sharing stories about his own losses, his son Jacob's death in Iraq, his wife Mary's battle with cancer, and the way that hope could survive even in the darkest moments. "That little girl is fighting, Bruno," he whispered. "Just like you fought for Stella, she's fighting for all of us." Dr. Elena Rodriguez brought in specialists from pediatric intensive care units, recognizing that Hope's needs more closely resembled those of a human premature infant than a typical wildlife patient. The collaboration between human and veterinary medicine created unprecedented treatment protocols that would influence both fields for years to come, but it also highlighted the experimental nature of every intervention they attempted. The financial cost of Hope's care spiraled beyond anything the facility had ever experienced, with round-the-clock intensive care requiring equipment and personnel that strained resources to their breaking point. Yet donations continued pouring in from around the world, with ordinary people sacrificing vacation funds and children emptying piggy banks to support a baby bear they would never meet, but who had somehow become a symbol of innocence worth protecting. Vincent Carruthers, awaiting trial in federal custody, made an unexpected request to establish a trust fund for Hope's medical expenses using the entirety of his personal assets. His lawyer delivered a written statement expressing the former professor's recognition that his quest to understand sacrificial love had created the very tragedy he now sought to help resolve. "If my son's death taught me anything," Vincent wrote, "it's that love requires action, not just observation." Bruno's deterioration became as concerning as Hope's medical crisis. The massive bear refused food for days at a time, his weight dropping precipitously as stress and grief took their toll on his massive frame. His behavior became increasingly erratic, alternating between frantic pacing and periods of near catatonic stillness that worried the medical team about his psychological stability. Stella's maternal instincts created another layer of complexity as she attempted to reach her struggling cub despite her own physical limitations. The female grizzly's vocalizations had taken on qualities that bear researchers had never documented, sounds that seemed specifically designed to comfort and encourage her daughter across the barriers of medical equipment and human intervention. The arrival of Dr. Michael Chen, a specialist in wildlife psychology from UC Davis, brought new insights into the emotional trauma that the entire bear family was experiencing. His assessment revealed that Bruno was showing symptoms consistent with complex grief disorder, a condition typically observed in highly intelligent species when facing prolonged uncertainty about a loved one's survival. "What we're witnessing goes beyond normal animal responses to offspring distress," Dr. Chen explained to the assembled medical team. "Bruno is experiencing anticipatory grief. He's already beginning to mourn a loss that hasn't occurred yet." This kind of psychological sophistication suggests cognitive abilities that we're only beginning to understand. The experimental treatment combining traditional Native American healing practices with modern neonatal intensive care began showing promising results as Hope responded to the ceremonial songs and herbal treatments that Elder Crow Feather administered alongside Dr. Rodriguez's medical interventions. The tiny cub's breathing improved when exposed to specific plant essences that had been used for centuries to strengthen young animals' respiratory systems. Tank's investigation into Vincent's research network had revealed that Hope's premature birth was a direct consequence of the stress Stella experienced during the python attack, creating a chain of causation that made Vincent legally responsible for the cub's medical crisis. The revelation added another dimension of tragedy to the story, as viewers worldwide grappled with the reality that human cruelty had created the suffering they were now desperately trying to heal. Sarah found herself questioning fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between human and veterinary medicine, as Hope's treatment required interventions that were essentially identical to those used for human premature infants. The tiny cub's responses to medical procedures, her clear preferences for certain caregivers, and her obvious recognition of her parents' vocalizations suggested consciousness and emotional complexity that challenged traditional veterinary approaches to wildlife care. The media attention surrounding Hope's crisis had evolved beyond news coverage into something approaching religious observance, with vigils held in communities worldwide and prayer services conducted in multiple languages for a baby bear who had become a symbol of innocence under threat. Children's hospitals reported increased volunteerism as people inspired by Hope's fight sought ways to help vulnerable young lives in their own communities. Bruno's breakthrough came when Hope first responded positively to his vocalizations, her tiny body showing measurable improvement in respiratory function when her father's encouraging sounds reached the neonatal unit. The connection between parent and child, maintained across barriers of glass and medical equipment, provided therapeutic benefits that no human intervention could replicate. The psychological toll on the human caregivers became increasingly apparent as days turned into weeks of intensive care. Sarah had not left the facility for more than a few hours at a time, her personal investment in the bear family's survival pushing her beyond normal professional boundaries. Tank found himself fielding calls from journalists and supporters at all hours, while Papa Thompson maintained his vigil despite his own advancing age and declining health. Hope's first successful unassisted breath came on a Tuesday morning as autumn sunlight streamed through the medical facility's windows. The tiny cub's lungs, strengthened by weeks of mechanical support and traditional healing treatments, finally achieved the stability necessary for independent survival. Her first vocalization, a weak but unmistakable cub call, brought Bruno running from across the facility, his massive frame trembling with excitement and relief. The moment when Hope was finally strong enough to be reunited with her parents marked a turning point, not just in her recovery, but in the entire family's healing process. Bruno's gentle investigation of his daughter, his obvious recognition of her improved condition, and his protective positioning around both Stella and the cubs demonstrated behavioral complexity that would influence wildlife psychology research for decades to come. Stella's recovery accelerated dramatically once Hope was declared stable, her maternal stress finally beginning to resolve as her family unit was restored to wholeness. The female grizzly's nursing improved, her appetite returned, and her vital signs showed consistent improvement for the first time since the cub's birth. The tragedy that had threatened to destroy everything they had fought to save had instead revealed new depths of love, resilience, and the fundamental connections that bind families together across species boundaries. Hope's survival became a testament to the power of combining scientific knowledge with traditional wisdom, human dedication with animal determination, and the simple faith that love could triumph over even the most devastating circumstances. The revelation that would redefine everything came not from medical tests or scientific analysis, but from Papa Thompson's trembling hands as he opened a weathered manila envelope that had arrived via overnight delivery from a Montana attorney's office. Inside were documents that Vincent Carruthers' legal team had discovered during their preparation for his defense. Research notes that predated the Python attack by 3 years, and detailed surveillance footage that painted an entirely different picture of the tragedy that had captivated the world. "My God," Papa Thompson whispered as he studied the photographs spread across the medical facility's conference table. "Bruno, these pictures are from 2021. Vincent has been watching you for 3 years." The images showed Bruno's first mate and cub, the family that Tank Rodriguez had unknowingly destroyed during what he believed was a routine predator control operation. The dates on the surveillance photos revealed that Vincent had been monitoring Bruno's grief, documenting his solitary behavior, and planning the python attack as a deliberate test of the bear's capacity for love after loss. Sarah felt her medical training collide with a rage she'd never experienced as she reviewed Vincent's detailed psychological profiles of both Bruno and Stella. The former professor had identified Stella as the optimal replacement mate for Bruno based on her gentle temperament and strong maternal instincts, then orchestrated their meeting through carefully placed food sources and habitat modifications. The python attack hadn't been random, it was the culmination of a 3-year psychological experiment designed to push Bruno's devotion to its absolute limits. Tank Rodriguez's world collapsed as he read Vincent's clinical notes describing the baseline trauma event that had prepared Bruno for the main experiment. The routine bear control operation that had haunted Tank's conscience for 3 years was revealed to be anything but routine. Vincent had deliberately led Tank to Bruno's first family through anonymous tips about aggressive bears threatening hikers. The former professor had orchestrated the deaths of Bruno's mate and cub to create the psychological conditions necessary for his research. "You son of a bitch," Tank breathed, his hands shaking as he held photographs of the tracking equipment Vincent had secretly placed on Bruno after the loss of his first family. "You watched him grieve. You watched him suffer for 3 years, and then you brought Stella into his life just so you could torture him again." The weight of his unwitting participation in Vincent's experiment threatened to crush Tank's newly constructed sense of redemption. Dr. Elena Rodriguez discovered additional files that revealed the extent of Vincent's manipulation of natural processes. Stella's pregnancy hadn't been natural timing. Vincent had used pheromone treatments and habitat modifications to ensure that she would conceive just before the planned python attack, creating maximum emotional stakes for Bruno's response. The premature birth of Hope and Connor was a direct result of the trauma Vincent had deliberately inflicted on their mother. Papa Thompson's recognition of Bruno took on new significance as Vincent's notes revealed that the former professor had known about their historical connection from the beginning. The bear that Papa Thompson had raised from a cub hadn't found his way to Crystal Lake by chance. Vincent had been guiding Bruno's movements for months, using the elderly man's regular photography visits as predictable variables in his experimental design. The most devastating revelation came from Vincent's psychological evaluation of Bruno, written just days before the python attack. The former professor had identified Bruno as the perfect subject because his previous trauma had created a psychological profile of extreme attachment disorder. The bear's capacity for love had been amplified by his experience of loss, making him willing to risk everything for a new family. Vincent had weaponized Bruno's grief, turning the bear's greatest strength into the mechanism of his torture. Sarah's examination of Vincent's research methodology revealed systematic violations of every ethical standard in animal research, but also groundbreaking insights into animal emotional intelligence that could revolutionize wildlife psychology. The former professor's meticulous documentation of Bruno's behavior provided unprecedented evidence of complex emotional processing, long-term memory, and sophisticated social reasoning in wild animals. The knowledge gained through torture offered benefits that created impossible moral dilemmas for the scientific community. Tank confronted Vincent in federal custody, demanding answers that no amount of explanation could satisfy. The former professor's confession revealed a man consumed by guilt over his son Connor's death, convinced that by proving the existence of truly sacrificial love in nature, he could somehow validate his son's final heroic act. "I needed to know that Connor's choice meant something," Vincent explained, his voice hollow with the weight of accumulated crimes. "If animals could choose love over survival, then my son's sacrifice was part of something universal, something meaningful." The discovery of Vincent's experimental design forced a complete re-evaluation of Bruno and Stella's story. Their love, which had seemed to represent pure natural emotion, was revealed to be the product of deliberate manipulation and calculated cruelty. Yet the bear's responses to the orchestrated tragedy had exceeded every prediction in Vincent's research, demonstrating emotional complexity and moral reasoning that transcended the artificial conditions of their testing. Papa Thompson struggled with the knowledge that his beloved Bruno had been targeted specifically because of their past relationship. Vincent's notes revealed that the former professor had researched Papa Thompson's history with the bear, identifying their bond as a factor that would intensify Bruno's emotional responses during the planned crisis. The elderly man's presence during the python attack hadn't been coincidence. It was part of Vincent's experimental design. Dr. Michael Chen's analysis of Vincent's psychological profiles revealed the sophisticated understanding of animal behavior that had made his experiments possible. The former professor had correctly predicted not just Bruno's willingness to fight for Stella, but his capacity to seek human assistance and his ability to cooperate with medical treatment. Vincent's research had proven the existence of animal consciousness and emotional intelligence that mainstream science was only beginning to acknowledge. The revelation that Hope's medical crisis was a direct result of Vincent's manipulation added new dimensions of tragedy to the story. The tiny cub's struggle for survival wasn't just a medical emergency, it was the final consequence of a 3-year campaign of psychological warfare against her family. Her recovery became not just a victory over biological limitations, but a triumph over deliberate human cruelty. Sarah found herself grappling with the ethical implications of using knowledge gained through animal torture. Vincent's research contained insights that could benefit wildlife conservation and veterinary medicine for generations, but accepting those benefits meant legitimizing the suffering he had inflicted. The Bear family's story had become a case study in the complex relationship between scientific progress and moral responsibility. Tank's investigation revealed that Vincent's research was part of a broader pattern of unethical wildlife studies conducted under the guise of conservation science. Universities and research institutions across the country were implicated in funding or supporting studies that prioritized data collection over animal welfare, using the noble goals of conservation to justify increasingly extreme experimental methods. The global audience that had followed Bruno and Stella's story with such emotional investment struggled to process the revelation that their beloved bear family had been victims of systematic abuse disguised as natural tragedy. Social media exploded with demands for justice, calls for research reform, and expressions of rage that transcended typical online activism into something approaching a worldwide movement for animal rights. Papa Thompson's final visit with Bruno before the bear's planned release back into the wild carried the weight of everything they had endured together. The elderly man spoke to the massive bear about forgiveness, about the possibility of healing from trauma, and about the strength required to trust again after betrayal. Bruno's response, a gentle nuzzling that seemed to acknowledge both their shared history and the future that lay ahead, provided closure that legal proceedings could never achieve. The truth about Vincent's experiments had transformed Bruno and Stella from symbols of natural love into representatives of resilience in the face of human cruelty. Their survival, their devotion to each other, and their successful raising of Hope and Connor became testaments to the power of love to endure even deliberate attempts to destroy it. The bears had not just survived Vincent's torture, they had transcended it, proving that authentic emotional bonds could not be artificially created or destroyed through manipulation. As the bear family prepared for their return to the wild, the knowledge of what they had endured and overcome added new meaning to their story. They were no longer just animals who had captured human attention through their devotion. They were survivors who had maintained their capacity for love despite systematic attempts to weaponize their emotions. Their journey from victims to symbols of hope represented the possibility of healing that extended far beyond the boundaries of species, offering lessons about resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring power of family bonds forged in the crucible of shared suffering. The release ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at Crystal Lake, the same shoreline where Bruno and Stella's ordeal had begun 6 months earlier. The location held symbolic significance that wasn't lost on the hundreds of people who had gathered to witness their return to the wild. Conservationists, tribal elders, medical staff, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by the bear's story of resilience and love. Papa Thompson stood at the water's edge, his weathered hand steady as he operated the release mechanism that would open the transport containers. At 83, the elderly photographer had insisted on being the one to give Bruno and Stella their freedom, completing a circle that had begun 20 years earlier when he first released a young Bruno into these same mountains. "Go on home, son," he whispered as the door swung open. "Take your family home." Bruno emerged first, his massive frame moving with the cautious dignity of a creature who had learned to trust but never to forget. His dark eyes surveyed the assembled humans with recognition rather than fear, pausing longest on Papa Thompson, Sarah, and Tank, the people who had fought beside him during the darkest moments of his family's crisis. Stella followed with Hope and Connor at her side, the now healthy cubs displaying the confident curiosity of young bears discovering their natural habitat for the first time. Dr. Sarah Mitchell watched through tears as the bear family moved toward the forest, her professional satisfaction tempered by the personal growth she had experienced through their care. The past 6 months had transformed her from a veterinarian focused solely on clinical outcomes into someone who understood the deeper connections between healing and love. Her engagement ring caught the morning sunlight as Tank Rodriguez took her hand, their own love story having blossomed in the shadow of Bruno and Stella's devotion. The George Thompson Wildlife Sanctuary, established with funds raised during the bear's recovery, would ensure that Crystal Lake remained protected habitat for generations to come. The facility's educational center already hosted thousands of visitors annually, teaching children and adults about wildlife conservation, animal intelligence, and the fundamental connections that bind all living creatures together. Papa Thompson had donated his entire life savings to the project, ensuring that Bruno's story would continue inspiring future conservationists long after the bears themselves had returned to the wild. Tank Rodriguez's transformation from haunted former hunter to leading advocate for ethical wildlife research had become as significant as the bear's physical recovery. His investigation into Vincent Carruthers' research network had resulted in new federal legislation protecting wildlife from experimental abuse, while his personal journey toward redemption offered hope for others seeking to heal from past mistakes. The ranger station at Crystal Lake now bore a plaque reading, "Second chances are earned through service to those we've wronged." Vincent Carruthers' 15-year federal sentence included mandatory participation in wildlife rehabilitation programs, his psychological expertise redirected toward healing rather than exploitation. His research, stripped of its unethical methodology, had contributed to groundbreaking advances in understanding animal emotional intelligence, proving that even knowledge gained through cruelty could be transformed into tools for protection and healing. The global impact of Bruno and Stella's story extended far beyond wildlife conservation into broader conversations about empathy, resilience, and the capacity for love to triumph over deliberate cruelty. Schools worldwide incorporated their story into curricula about ethics, biology, and moral responsibility, while their images became symbols of hope for countless individuals facing their own struggles with trauma and recovery. Hope and Connor, now thriving 6-month-old cubs, represented the future that had emerged from near tragedy. Their healthy development under both parental care and human medical intervention had created new protocols for wildlife emergency medicine, while their obvious comfort around carefully screened humans suggested possibilities for cooperative conservation that previous generations had never imagined. As the bear family disappeared into the forest that would be their home, the assembled crowd stood in respectful silence, understanding that they had witnessed something that transcended ordinary wildlife management. Bruno and Stella's journey from victims of human cruelty to symbols of healing and hope offered proof that love, whether between animals or humans, possessed the power to transform suffering into strength, tragedy into triumph, and despair into unshakable faith in the possibility of redemption. The morning mist rising from Crystal Lake seemed to carry their story forward, a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths about love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds of family come not from human experience, but from the wild hearts that beat in harmony with our own. Dear friends, Bruno and Stella's story reminds us that true love doesn't diminish with age. It deepens, becomes more precious, more worth fighting for. Like many of us who've weathered life's storms, Bruno had lost everything once before, yet he found the courage to love again. At our stage of life, we understand what Papa Thompson felt watching Bruno's devotion, that bone-deep recognition of what real commitment looks like. We've buried parents, maybe spouses, watched children move away, felt the weight of being forgotten by a world that prizes youth over wisdom. But Bruno showed us something profound. Love isn't about how much time we have left. It's about how completely we choose to give our hearts to those who matter. Whether it's caring for a grandchild, supporting a friend through illness, or simply choosing kindness over bitterness, we still have so much love to give. Papa Thompson, at 78, found purpose in protecting Bruno's family, proving it's never too late to matter, to make a difference, to be someone's hero. Our weathered hands and silver hair don't diminish our capacity to love. They prove we've earned the wisdom to love well. What moment in your life showed you that love grows stronger with age? Have you ever witnessed devotion that reminded you why fighting for family, blood, or chosen is always worth it? Share your story below.